Okay, hi. We're going to talk about what is the best diet for humans. Okay, the diet I'm going to share with you, this is the diet that I personally eat. 100% plant-based, only plant foods. This diet is low salt plant-based. And I am what you would call a health vegan, meaning that I eat plant-based only for health reasons. It typically has about 200 to 500 milligrams a day of sodium. I don't ever count. I just don't add any salt to my food. And I don't eat any processed food. Zero, none, not a processed food. When you eat that way, that's probably about like what our ancestors ate. Persons who eat this way essentially almost never have hypertension. Virtually never. It's so rare it's not even funny. And when I say low salt, I mean low sodium and chloride. So there's a big advantage of low sodium because sodium is a vasoconstrictor, predisposes to hypertension, inhibits secretion of endothelial nitric oxide. Vasoconstriction drives up blood pressure, of course. Low chloride, so sodium chloride. Chloride is not good for you either. I mean, it's a halogen. Halogens in general are not the greatest things, but what's unique about chloride is it's an anion, negatively charged ion in your blood. It'll displace your bicarbonate ions, and thus a high sodium chloride diet will induce a low-grade metabolic acidosis because of the displacement of the chloride anions, which are part of your acid buffer. Okay, the next thing about 100% plant-based diet. When I say plant-based, I mean low-fat plants. I do not eat avocados or seeds ever. I'll eat nuts occasionally, about once every couple of months. I'll sometimes have some Brazil nuts because they got a lot of selenium in it, but I get adequate selenium from my other foods. I don't really even need to do that, but I do that maybe once every 4 months is what I do it in reality. I wrote once a month here. Actually, I do it less often. You want low fat. What I've noticed is, you know, stupid people get brainwashed by a slogan very easily. They hear good fats, I want good fats. There's no such thing as good fats. Just to let you know, there's no such thing as good fats. Any type of fat you would ingest will have detrimental effects on blood flow and increase the risk of atherosclerosis. And the so-called healthy fats, omega-3s, there's problems with those too. It's not that easy to purify omega-3 fats from fish oil. Omega-3 fats, they're a PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid. They're highly predisposed to lipid peroxidation because between those double bonds, let's say on the 6 and the 3 carbon, the 6 and the 9 carbon, they have what's called a methylene bridge. The carbon in between them has only a weak pull on its hydrogen, and it's very prone to being oxidized and leading to free radical formation. If you look at it, for example, when you buy omega-3 fats in a store, it'll be in an opaque container because sunlight can cause oxidation of it, and they'll want you to store it in a fridge. It's very hard to not have those go rancid. There's often contaminants in them. Omega-3s are now associated with increased risk of prostate carcinoma. There's some other world-class nutrition experts who believe that they cause significant immune suppression, which can decrease the ability to contain metastatic disease for some cancers. So, bottom line, I don't recommend them. I don't think there's any such thing as good fat. And then you're going to hear, oh, olive oil. Olive oil has the best advertising of probably any product in the world. You know, they call it extra virgin olive oil, like you want to have romance with it. It's liquid fat. All oils are liquid fat. They're all bad for blood flow, and that's been shown by the brachial artery ultrasound tests that they impair the ability of the artery to vasodilate. Okay, what else? The lower the fat in your diet, the less likely people are to be fat. People who eat these really low-fat diets based on potatoes, based on rice, for example, they're almost always skinny. The body mass index of a health vegan is very low. I mean, I don't know for sure what it is. I would guess it's in the ballpark of about 22. With a modern meat eater, junk food eater, standard American diet, SAD diet, SAD, it's in the ballpark of at least around 30, you know, depending on the age of the patients. They get fatter as they get older. Should be 100% organic. The reason I say 100% organic, and by the way, you're going to see some world famous nutrition doctors who say, oh, organic doesn't matter. I disagree with them because I've been studying a lot about the herbicides and pesticides associated with non-organic food, and they're bad. There's a lot of serious side effects. There's books written about the side effects of those. I've read those books, and I can tell you, If you have the ability to eat 100% organic, you want to eat 100% organic. Some people say, oh, organic's BS, they don't necessarily follow the rules, and it's true that sometimes maybe they don't, but multiple research studies have been done where they checked the blood, the urine, hair, fingernails, all the stuff for residues of pesticides and herbicides, and they found they're much higher in people who do not eat organic. So 100% organic. And by the way, in terms of liquids, what do I drink? I only drink reverse osmosis filtered water. That's it. I would never drink tap water. There's too many chemicals in tap water. I would never drink it. If I had to, I would be willing to drink carbon filtered tap water, but I would never do so willingly. I would always have reverse osmosis. I don't drink too much water either. I don't think you need this 8 cups a day. I think that's all nonsense and advertising. I get my water mostly through the plant foods that I eat, or let's say mixed with oatmeal, for example. What's the main food to eat in a plant-based diet of this type? Starch. Most of your calories should come from starch. What is starch? Starch is basically a polymer of glucose, and it's also going to have cellulose in it. That's fiber, because a plant cell, by definition, supports its plasma cell membrane, stabilizes it, rigidifies it with cellulose, which is the fiber that your good gut bacteria need to eat. That's how they maintain your intestinal lining, your enterocytes for your enteric tract, colonocytes you could call them for the colon, and those prevent you from having leaky gut and all the problems associated with that, like inflammation and autoimmune disease. The other thing is they satisfy hunger. That's because they're low caloric density. Early satisfaction of hunger is by stretching the stomach. And so they provide early satiety. Satiety is to satisfy hunger. Then when the starch goes into the small bowel, the small intestine has to peel off that fiber to separate it away from the glucose before the glucose is absorbed from the small intestine into the blood. So you get a slow increase in blood glucose in your blood, and it stays normal a prolonged amount of time. You feel good when your blood glucose level is normal, so you get prolonged satisfaction of hunger with the fewest possible calories, and that's why starch eaters are skinny. The more fat you eat, the fatter you will be. The more protein you eat, the higher your risk of cancer, the higher your risk of kidney failure. Okay, what are some examples of starch-eating populations? The Okinawans are super famous as one of the most long-lived populations in the whole world. They've been studied in multiple contexts. They've been studied by Dan Buettner with his National Geographic Blue Zone research, showing they're one of the 5 healthiest populations in the world, with the highest percent number of persons in their 90s and 100s that were still physically fit and mentally sharp. There's an American physician named Wilcox, went over there with his brother, another Wilcox who was a PhD, and they were working with some Japanese physicians to study the Okinawan centenarians, persons 100 years of age and older. And they found that a significant number of these centenarian plus population had nothing wrong with them. You couldn't find a medical problem on them, people over 100 years of age. A lot of Americans that make it into their 90s or 100s quite often are just sort of like survivors with a lot of comorbidities, a lot of other disease. These Okinawans were over 100, doing push-ups, still working, incredible. Okay, China, we talked about China before, eating before 1975, 80 to 90% rice, and nobody was fat, hardly any diabetes, hypertension, any of that stuff. In Ireland, for many, many decades, these manual laborers would eat 10 pounds of potatoes a day. And they could also supplement that with some beer or with some water or milk, but the main point was you can get everything you want from potatoes. They'll grow underground, they'll be nutritionally complete. And people have been put in metabolic wars and only eaten potatoes for months and been totally fine. Potato is considered by some of the greatest nutrition doctors in the world, like Dr. McDougall, for example. He might be the best nutrition doctor in the world, and he says he thinks potatoes are probably the best food in the world. And it used to be, I would probably argue with that and say, what about rice? Rice is probably the best food in the world, but rice is a little bit messed up. We've talked about that in other lectures. Rice has been messed up with the whole arsenic problem from the chicken feces, and we talked about that in other lectures. So rice is no longer something that I would eat every day, even though I used to eat it every day. You know, rice is great and it's real simple. And you can still find low arsenic rice in some places. And don't get me wrong, arsenic isn't just in rice. It's a much bigger problem in chicken and lots of other foods, but just to be aware of that. Tarahumara is a population in northern Mexico, and demographically they have a lot in common with the Pima. The Pima are now in Arizona, and the Pima have now for many years eaten a standard American diet. tons and tons of obesity, gallstones, diabetes, hypertension, myocardial infarction, stroke, everything that goes with the standard American high-fat diet. And then also, don't be fooled by stuff like the Mediterranean diet. Mediterranean diet is bogus. What does it really mean? Ansel Keys studied diets in the Mediterranean region back in the 1950s and 1960s. And he was especially impressed by the people in Crete, but they didn't want to call it the Cretan diet. When somebody says Mediterranean diet, you don't even know what they're talking about. What country specifically are they referring to? And most of the time when I hear people say Mediterranean diet, they're just using it as an excuse to eat meat and fish and olive oil, and those foods are not good for you. Okay, Tarahumara are incredibly healthy. They eat a lot of corn, beans, squash, and greens. Also populations in rural Africa, followed by Dennis Burkitt, that were eating plant-based diets were dramatically healthier than likewise demographically matched populations eating more meat, oils, or refined foods. The Tarahumara are famous. They've got a holiday once a year where all the men in town, not just the fast guy, all the guys run like over 100 miles in 2 days. It's normal to be super fit. Okay, plant-based diet, I also recommend eating a good amount of vegetables, at least one salad every day, like a 5 or 7 ounces of salad or more every day. You look in the center of a chlorophyll molecule, you got magnesium. What are most Americans deficient in? Potassium, magnesium, and fiber, and antioxidants. Why? Because they don't eat enough plants. Fruits, I think, are great. Fruits are a lot more expensive. Starch is cheap. Oatmeal's cheap. Quinoa is cheap. Rice and beans are cheap. Those are the starches, by the way. Rice, beans, potatoes, sweet potatoes, quinoa, squash. Fruits are great. I've talked about those in other lectures, but fruits, you know, they're really low in protein, means that they're low in acid, they're very alkaline. That's thought to decrease one's risk of cancer. I recommend no meat, not one bite. Meat increases your risk of cancer like in at least 15 different ways. Even if you're genetically lucky and you can handle, you got the especially good enzymes to handle 14 of those, meat's still got additional ways to increase your risk of cancer and heart disease and stroke. Meat is not good for humans. We're really not made to eat it. Tiny amounts, we can handle it. And there is no such thing as a 100% plant-based population out in the real world. But Americans have eaten so much meat when they were young, I recommend become 100% plant-based. I've been 100% plant-based for about a little bit over 2 years. Before that, for many, many, many years, I was probably about 90% plant-based. I hung on to skim milk for a while, but the more I learned about milk, then I realized, no, it increases your risk of prostate cancer, increases your risk of autoimmune disease, and there's a bunch of other problems with it. We won't get into it now that I don't drink it anymore. And all the cereals, you know, they tended to have MSG in them. I don't want anything to do with MSG. I don't eat any MSG either. I went through all my food. I won't eat any MSG. I recommend no alcohol. I know you probably heard. And by the way, what percentage of people follow this? It's probably, you know, 1 out of 500. It's what I follow because I want to be as healthy as possible. You as an individual do whatever you want, but it's good to know what is the healthiest diet. You can check all this stuff on the internet very quickly. It'll be pretty obvious. People say, oh, what about alcohol being cardioprotective? I don't really believe it, and it certainly is not cardioprotective with, you know, 3 or more drinks, and I think it probably isn't that cardioprotective with lesser amounts. Alcohol is ethyl alcohol, tends to get made into saturated fat in the liver, like made into palmitate, for example, C16-0. That's a saturated fat with 16 carbons. Alcohol is a tumor promoter, a cancer promoter. I don't want to be pouring that over your tongue and your throat and your esophagus every day. Those are terrible places to get cancer. Also, alcohol increases for women, increases the risk of breast cancer. You don't need it. It's a neurotoxin to your brain. I always thought it was stupid. Oh, you want to get drunk? Yeah. What does getting drunk mean? It means poisoning your brain. Why do that? It's stupid. People just do it out of conformity and habit. They do a lot of stupid stuff out of conformity and habit. No caffeine. People say, oh, I'm so stressed. I wish I wasn't so stressed. And then they have a cup of coffee. Well, that's stupid. Because what does coffee do? The caffeine in coffee, tea, any type of caffeinated beverage, energy drink, soda pop, it increases the same hormones as stress. Increases cortisol and the catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, same thing as adrenaline and noradrenaline. Those all impair sleep. They impair immune function. The catecholamines are siderophores, facilitating the transfer of iron to bacteria and infections. No caffeine. So anyways, that's the healthiest diet. 100% plant-based, 100% organic, starch-based for satisfaction of hunger, vegetables to supply nutrients, and a person who exercises a lot, like a younger person or a triathlete or something, they can eat lots and lots of fruits, but the fruits are expensive. The starch is cheap. No alcohol, no caffeine, low sodium, low fat, no meat, not one bite, no oil, not one drop, and that's the healthiest diet in the world.